It's so fabulous to be with you again. It was a pleasure having you lead one of our amazing sessions at our Bright Symposium this year. One of the things that I want to follow up on is everybody talked about how important it is to actually not just collect mental health data, but to look at it, right?
Yeah.
How are we utilizing, collecting, and looking at it? One of the questions that was asked in a follow up was they were wondering, how do you balance or how do you communicate the importance of collecting this data in a climate, or you could almost say where people were saying we don't want to know, because if we don't know, we don't have to do anything about it. And if we know, that makes the problem bigger than what we thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
How do you advocate for collecting data in that type of environment?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and it's something that's come up from the inception of our screening program in Methuen. So we're talking like I've talked about this problem for 10 years.
Mm.
And I think the thing that we need to remember is that the act of screening doesn't create the problem. The problem is there. We just now know about it and can do something about it. So the idea that we're going to maybe overwhelm ourselves by engaging in this process, we're already contending with the needs. We could just do it more thoughtfully in a more proactive and preventative manner. And to the point of like, well, what if I can't respond to all of it all at once? Well, scale it back. Like, don't do it all at once. Make sure that you're screening at the right scale to match your level of readiness to respond to the data. But overarchingly, like the idea that like we probably shouldn't like check under the hood to make sure things are okay, because then the problem won't be there. Well, the problem's there, right? Like, so let's be real about that, but let's also position ourselves well to engage in a more proactive and preventative approach to getting care for students. Because when we do screening well, we get ahead of problems, we address emerging concerns, we reduce instances of crisis. So we actually end up saving a lot of time on the back end.
One of the things that comes out of this idea of doing screening, and mental health wise, is that we're identifying and people are seeing more and more kids. They're even calling it the youth mental health crisis. Some people are calling it the 504 plan crisis. Um, and so we're seeing that now districts are being forced to respond in a way that they haven't before. And that response doesn't mean I'm able to increase the number of mental health professionals within my building. What would you have or thoughts and suggestions that you would give leaders, particularly about addressing what comes out of the screening or what's happening within the districts with this increase in the number of youth and kids who are seeking mental health services and accommodations?
Yeah, great question. I think when I think of the what I want to tell leaders, um, a few things. One, if we're seeing broadly that we have a lot of students with needs, and these needs are not being addressed in an individual fashion, I think that's probably pretty normal. Like, I don't think that we're ever going to get ourselves out of what you just talked about, the youth mental health crisis, by trying to double down on individual services for every kid. They're just too much in terms of need. So it does make me think of like, what are we doing universally? What are we doing at the tier 1 level to be able to provide care to students in a broad, practice-based or curriculum-based fashion that will provide skills and knowledge that students can leverage to be able to prevent the onset of more serious problems. It does make me think about tier 2, the missing tier, for a lot of MTSS triangles, and that we tend to go straight from 1 to 3. So how are we developing tier 2 programming that provides group therapy, short-term individual therapy, so that we can get to more students, but not sacrifice quality, quality tier 2 services. Um, it also makes me think about more of a infrastructure piece. Have our leaders actually taken a look at the staffing models that they have? Have they taken a look at how they're leveraging their mental health providers? Um, Working with a lot of districts, I tend to ask the question every time: do you have a written staffing model that spells out who does what in terms of providing mental health care to kids? And a lot of times what I hear is we haven't looked at that in 10, 20, 30 years. So the way in which we leverage mental health staff matters. the way in which we prepare and support mental health staff matters. So it makes me think of things like professional development planning and clinical supervision and clinical leadership so that we can build staffing models and support mental health staff in actually doing the work. Because the reality is we are under leveraging many mental health staff in districts because we're dispatching them to do things that really don't relate to their role. It takes a thoughtful approach to staffing and to deploying these staff members effectively across a well-balanced MTSS for SEL mental health to ensure that we can get to more students and provide more care.
One of the things, and this will be my last question that we're hearing from, and that was the question is, how do I get, what type of training am I supposed to be giving my staff, right? If we're gonna do this universal screener, we're gonna put staffing in place, what type of training do I need to put in place for the overall body or the overall staff in order for them to actually be able to cultivate a climate, of wellness, a climate of learning for all kids within the school?
Yeah, if I think if we're going to engage in universal screening and we're going to make that a thing that's okay to do within a school and then we're going to do it well, there are a few components that we have to account for. There are a few pieces of training or pieces of readiness that we have to account for. One, I would say you need a team. You need to be able to have a group of individuals that have, engaged in some thoughtful planning around the when and the how and the who, and that they're resourced well. They can engage in communication with a broad community of folks. They can talk to stakeholders about why this is important. So establishing a good team that can bolster buy-in, but also, thoughtfully plan the work. Then we need to figure out, well, who are we actually going to screen and for what? Why did we choose this measure over that one? Why did we pick this group of students? So some planning around, the purpose and intent of screening. Why are we engaging in this to begin with? And if the goal is to find more students with depression or anxiety, well, I hope we're using a measure that kind of points at that. If we're engaging in a process where we kind of want to understand the climate, well, that's a different measure. So there's some planning around what we're actually going to use as a tool and which population we're going to screen. Then we get into communication with the broader community. How are we going to engage in consent? How are we going to ask parents if it's okay to do this? And what are we going to do when parents have questions about this process? Where does the data go? What about confidentiality? How are you using these data? Kids will have the same questions. So there's a body of work that is about preparing students and families for what this means and what it also doesn't mean. We're not going to share this information broadly. This doesn't, kind of follow your student into college. This is information that we're going to keep secure where you want to understand your kids' needs. Then we get into the process of actually following up with students, administering the measure and following up with students. And the big question that comes up there is, who's doing that? I'm going to call back to the staffing model piece. When I work with districts around screening, one of the questions that inevitably comes up is, who is the follow-up team for these students that are scoring in the moderate to severe range on these measures? And my question to them is often, have you considered all of your mental health staff? Have you considered all of the different roles within your staffing system? Because you will eventually need to leverage your entire team if you're going to get to the entire population. So that's a big question and a lot of readiness that's necessary. Sometimes at that point, kind of to your question around professional development, I notice that districts are starting to think about, geez, what professional development have I not provided to my team over the years that we really need to do first before we start to engage in universal screening and then follow-up care. And sometimes that relates to critical incident management, like suicide risk assessment and threat assessment. Sometimes it's around evidence-based therapeutic care, like CBT, DBT. Sometimes it's around use of data to inform practice. But there is a body of work in there around professional development that builds capacity so that team can feel good about follow-up. Then we actually follow up, and now we're at the triangle, right? Now we have to figure out what services actually exist for these kids, and have we planned for that? So that's a whole additional set of work that people have to engage in around mapping out their MTSS triangle around what referrals can we make to what services, and then how are we going to make those referrals thoughtfully with data and monitor students as they move through those services so that they don't stay in those services forever. So I can think of like 12 different points in that process where professional development is necessary, but that progression really is what I typically see with districts.
One of the things, and I would love for you to just close with is, what advice would you give to someone that's beginning the process? The key thing that, like, if you want to be successful at implementing screening with universal screening within your district or within your school, here's what you need to keep in mind.
Yeah, I say this. I say this constantly, and for some people watching this, they're gonna be like, "Yep, I've heard this before." One kid, one measure, one day. You don't
Mhm.
go into universal screening 1,000 kids from the word go. You have to start very small, but you do have to start. So like, get it off the ground with one kid, try it out, make sure it's a kid that's already enrolled in services. You're not looking for a new student at this point. You're just practicing with a student. Make sure that you understand what the student's presenting concern is, get a matched measure for that concern. Let's make it easy to practice screening. So find a kid that is already being serviced, use a simple, reliable measure that is easy to score, easy to understand. Make sure the family of that kid loves you so that when you ask, can I try this out? They're just going to be like, of course, Courtney, you're amazing. And just practice with one kid and learn from that. You don't have to screen 1,000 kids to learn about the process of screening. You just got to screen one kid thoughtfully and then reflect on that.
One kid, one measure, one day.
That's
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks, Courtney.